Okay, welcome everybody to the April 23rd meeting of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. I'm Erica Borneman, as you know, and Catherine will not be joining us this week because she's on vacation with the kids. It is spring break for many schools in Vermont, so I'll be leading solo here. For today's call, we have a couple of things that we want to go over. We don't have a huge agenda, but we will just go over the we'll go over the agenda, and then we'll do introductions, and we'll ask two more members and one more staff support person to introduce themselves for a couple of minutes and give us a deeper dive into them so we can get to know them a little bit more. And then we're going to talk with Jane Lazarchak about the climate action plan framework that she sent us and I sent around this morning. And that way it'll give us a little bit more of an opportunity to frame the tasks that we have in our work plan as they associate to what's needed in the climate action plan. And we have some time for a public comment at the end, and we'll adjourn. So with that, I'm just going to do a quick roll call. I see we've got, for members, we have Chad Farrell on, and Secretary Curley, and Joe Segali, and myself. And so that is technically a quorum, but I'm hoping a few more people are able to join us. So we'll move right into the review and approval of the agenda. So did everybody have a chance to take a look at the agenda? It's on the website. Do we have any additions or clarifications that are needed?
No.
No. Thanks, Joe. Okay, so we'll move forward. We don't need a motion or anything. There's a link to the minutes from the April 16th meeting in there if you want to take a look at those, and just let me know if there's any revisions that need to be made to those before they get finalized. Okay, so last week we had a couple of folks introduce themselves in a little bit more detail. So we'll open it up for two more members this time and another staff support person. And I'll just let you speak up if you'd like to introduce yourself in more detail. If you don't speak up, I'll have to call on you. So there's only so many of us. Who would like to begin?
Sure, I'll do it.
Thanks, Joe.
My name's Joe Segali, and I'm the Director of Policy, Planning, and Research Bureau at the Agency of Transportation. And I'm not sure, I can't remember what sort of the total extent of this, but I guess I'll just say that I got involved in resilience when I first came to the Agency of Transportation in 2011. So it's closing in on 10 years now. And I started work in November of 2011, and the agency, just like all of state government, was still actively working on the recovery to Irene. And I'm a transportation planner, traffic engineer, and I have a background in planning and in engineering. And when I came to work I was interviewed in July. When I came to work in November, everything had changed, and I was hearing all these terms I was not familiar with at all from emergency management kind of approach, and including the word resilience, which I know what that means by definition. But so I started thinking about, I've been in transportation long enough to know that as soon as we get through the recovery and get the last mile open, all the other demands are going to still be piling up out there. And that probably resilience and thinking about floods is going to, drop to the back burner for sure. And so I was thinking, well, how do we integrate it into what we do on a regular basis, just like the way that we do with safety? And so I got involved and came up with a plan to develop a resilience planning tool and work with VEM. It took a while, but we got the money for it, and I've been working on that the last 4 or 5 years. And it's a great tool, and it's going to be the basis for. I think there's going to be specific funding coming from resilience. I know there is. We expect that in the infrastructure plan that's going to come out of the Congress probably in the next few months, but also there'll be some programs in the next reauthorization of the transportation bill, which will be later this year as well. So that kind of the work that I've been doing, I like to think is going to position us to sort of develop our program around flood resilience. So, and so I've been kind of dealing with resilience at the agency since I got here. And I think that's probably why the secretary asked me to kind of be on this committee. I'm not sure what else you'd like to know, but that's it for me.
Just your favorite flavor of ice cream, Joe?
Chocolate.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a public meeting,
easy.
so we need to make sure we know that.
Yeah. If we ever actually get together, right? Which I think we will. I think we will before this is over. We may actually be able to do it in person. And I have had my second shot, so I'm ready.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Joe. Would anybody else like to introduce themselves in a bit more detail?
I could go. If that's okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Curley. I'm the Secretary of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. And my involvement came about because of my role as the agency secretary, but I'm admittedly really excited to be here and have the opportunity to learn and also be a part of the solution. So other than that, I don't have a really a strong background to share in terms of climate and resiliency, but I certainly can share a little bit about my background. I'm a former business owner. I actually owned a fuel hauling company and a gas station and convenience store with my husband for a couple decades. And then prior to the role as the agency secretary, I was the commissioner of labor for about 2.5 years. And so that's kind of my background, and my education and training is in accounting. I'm a certified public accountant. That's all I got.
Thanks so much. I think so it's worth mentioning when we talk about hazard mitigation and disaster recovery, obviously Commerce and Community Development and AOT are huge partners in the state recovery plan and the state hazard mitigation plan. Mm-hmm. And so, we're used to working together and our staffs working together, but I just wanted to note that because it is these are folks that are no strangers to discussions about resilience and to implementing projects that improve overall resilience in the state. So good choices to have you folks on this subcommittee.
Glad to be here.
Good. And then we can open it up to one of our staff support people. Okay, Marion, it's your turn. Go ahead.
All right. Sorry, I'll put my camera on for you. Caught me a little off guard. I'm working on some vaccine stuff, so I was trying to answer an email there. Hi, everyone. My name is Marion Woles. I'm a planner with Vermont Emergency Management. My work is primarily focused on working with state agencies on emergency planning efforts sort of across the spectrum of emergency management. I work a lot with state agencies that serve primarily in our SEOC as well as on our state emergency management plan. Also do some work with other partners and agencies to work on our threat and hazard assessment, which is conducted on an annual basis, which really measures our capability gaps in terms of emergency management. And then I also do some work with regional planning commissions on emergency planning efforts. What else? My background is in community planning. I have done some work on more of the sort of resilient side with regional planning commissions. So to kind of see that connection here with more of the emergency management side and assessment at the municipal level. Let's see, been working a lot on vaccine planning, but when I'm not doing that right now, I enjoy being outside and biking and running. So I'm glad to see the sun shining and the snow melting.
Me too. Me too. Yeah, right now Marion is knee deep in assisting the health department with vaccine clinic planning, along with a couple more of our folks that are basically Department of Health employees right now. That's good. So for a good cause. Well, thank you all very much, and we'll continue doing that until we have everybody introduced on the panel. So with that, we'll move into member updates, and this is just the time where folks can provide updates. What this is going to morph into, and we'll probably change this for the next agenda, is we will ask not only our members if they have any updates from any of the other Climate Council subcommittees or activities, but we will also ask the task leads for the items on the work plan that are due to provide updates on where they're at, what's going on with that. And it'll just be very high level, just as a quick check-in. And that's assuming that we're not going to do a deeper dive into that specific area for that meeting. So we'll just make that clear on the next agenda. But we've got Chad has been, he's our liaison to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. And so he may have an update, and anybody else that would like to provide any other updates, you're welcome to. Oh, you're muted.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. So good afternoon, everyone. Yes. So I was admitted as the liaison to the cross-sector mitigation committee. The first meeting was last Thursday. I had already was tied up, so I have not joined, but I have the next, they meet every other Thursday from 11 to 2. So I've got those times blocked out in my calendar moving forward, and I'll look forward to providing, additional information to this subcommittee with respect to what's going on there. So nothing to report as of yet, Erica, but I'm excited to join that subcommittee as a liaison.
Great. Thank you very much. Are there any other updates from members?
Yeah, I can provide an update on the inventory working group. I think it's task 1 or objective 1 or strategy 1, whatever. And we met for the first time on Monday of this week, and just to kind of get organized, and we went over the framework of the inventory and kind of made some modifications, got some good feedback on that. And it includes myself, Stephanie, and Mike Burke and Marion as well. And so we did kind of stumble across some questions where I think we're going to need some more direction, and we probably don't have time to talk about those today. And maybe possibly at the next meeting we can get into those. But and so yeah, that's where we are right now. And I sort of related to that, we also realize there's probably some overlap with the agriculture and ecosystems subcommittee, because they're doing some work on, looking at resilience for those sectors as well. So I did reach out to those guys. I haven't heard back yet. And I did watch a little bit of their meeting, because I kind of discovered that they're using a multi-criteria analysis approach to prioritizing their recommendations and screening them or prioritizing them. And it might be something we want to think about as well for what we're doing. It seems like we want to have some consistency among the different subcommittees. And Jane probably knows about that and was part of that discussion. But I was interested in it because I think could be useful in the work that we're going to do as well.
So was that?
Yeah, go ahead, Erica.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry, I was going to just ask a little bit more detail about that, but go ahead, Jane.
So 2 comments on that. First, I just wanted to suggest around the inventory that I'm glad you picked up on that, Joe, and actually at one of the Ag and Ecosystem subcommittees, as they were starting to think about the inventory, I spoke about your work and the work that preceded some of those original Climate Council meetings to inventory programs, and suggested that there should be sort of either coordination from the onset, or sort of like let one subcommittee start and then the next subcommittee build, but rather than each going it independently and coming up with like a very similar inventory. So I spoke to that, and I'm glad. Did you reach out? And then I'll just say that today, with their subcommittee this morning, we started to do sort of similar work planning to what you all have done. And so they all have inventory within their task breakout groups also. So I think speaking about how we sort of refine that and think about that sooner rather than later would be really important. So I'm glad you reached out to Billy and Abby. I assume is who you reached out to, or?
Yes,
that,
yeah.
okay.
They haven't had a chance to get back to me yet, but I decided I'd watch a little bit of the meeting just to kind of, and that's when I stumbled across the multi-criteria analysis.
Yeah.
thing.
So then I'll say I have that flagged to think about because
Okay.
and talk about with the steering committee because Lauren Oates has suggested that we bring that to cross-sector as a tool also. There are a lot of benefits to multi-criteria analysis, and there are also some cons, I think. And so using it, I don't think we want to use it as a decision-making tool. We would want to use it as you suggested, as a way to prioritize and a way to think about co-benefits of strategies and recommendations, and just one tool. And it's in one of the, when we ran through just even one example in that subcommittee around wetland restoration and plugged it through, it just generated really great discussion. But you can also see how time consuming it could be. And then also as a public tool, and a public process, it won't always, like wetland restoration with respect to multiple like co-benefits and everything just seems like from where I sit, it seems like a no-brainer. But then when we went through it, people had very different opinions from where they sat on that as a strategy, sequestration and other benefits. And so it's just interesting because if you play that out in a public and it doesn't yield the result you want, and there's the transparency aspect of it. So, which is both excellent and also challenging. So I think that we need to think about consistency and prioritization of ranking tools. And then I'll also suggest that what they brought a lot into that multi-criteria analysis tool was equity components.
Yes.
Which are also going to come to everybody from just transitions, both on the front end with the principles and the equity assessment. Right. So is that the best way to get at it with a multi-criteria analysis tool, or will there be other tools to evaluate equity? But yes, well, I think you're right that we should have some consistent approach to how we prioritize our strategies and then our recommendations going forward.
Okay. And I guess, I think we can proceed, just from the point of view, let's at least get the inventory done and maybe not worry about analyzing it at the moment. I don't know what Stephanie may think about that, but and that way we can just keep moving forward. And then maybe there would be some value in I hate to suggest another meeting, but just like a one-time meeting to kind of, whoever's working on these in each of the subcommittees to try to come to an agreement and understanding of how this is all going to be done, and just tweak the methodology when we're ready to do that. And instead of me talking to one group and then maybe another group or whatever, but so that's something we can think about later on.
Well, I don't know if this is a good time to just bring this up, but and this is going to be talked about at the council meeting on Monday, so it's in no way decided yet, but there's been a lot of thought. I know we are like meeting overload right now with all this work, but it feels like a need for intentional touch points for the co-chairs along the way. And so one idea, and we'll talk about how to get that, but one idea was that the council meetings became shorter and more frequent. And then we had like co-chair updates at those council meetings, especially related to where there was, cross-cutting issues or decision points that needed impact, to help with input from others. And then actually, though, I was reminded when we were thinking about that we actually in the process roadmap laid out that at the steering committee level, that would be the place where we would convene co-chairs. And so now the intent is on off weeks from the council meetings, every other week then. So once a month at steering committee meetings, the co-chairs will come and try to think about tools and templates and crosscut and that kind of ideas. So I'm hopeful that'll, and I don't think this will go on forever. I really think it's going to be for like the next 2 months where it's sort of intensive around that coordination, and then it really feeds up and into the council about how decisions are made. So
Sounds good.
thanks, Jen. But yes, proceed with the inventory, and then we'll go from there.
Any other comments or updates from members? Okay, great. We can move into, the agenda's gone, but I think we're moving into going over the climate action plan framework with Jane. And that is linked, it's linked in your agenda. It's also, I sent it out in the email this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. I have it open if folks would like me to share it. And before I do that, just since it gets harder for me to see everybody and navigate since I'm just on a laptop, I'll start by saying that I think this is a first step, and the intent is to feed the conversation around what the end game is for this first climate action plan that's due December 1st, to really think about the structure and format of what we're all working towards, and think about the specificity that we provide for in this first climate action plan. So just remembering that it is an iterative process, the plan. It will be updated at the very least every 4 years, but can be updated, and perhaps it might be this first time out of the gate more often than every 4 years. That's some suggestions I've heard from folks, is that to get us this first plan, maybe we'll have to update it even more frequently right out of the gate around the statutory requirements in order to meet the statutory requirements for greenhouse gas reduction. So the first step is to sort of agree conceptually on the outline and what the plan looks like. And then my hope is to make it much more useful for the subcommittees to take it to the next step and to draft the actual templates for recommendations and strategies, and to let you all sort of see the tools like Joe just spoke to with the multi-criteria analysis of how we're compiling it all up so that we can all start to have a common understanding of the framework that we're building up into. And so what I'll tee up for this conversation with all of you before we look at it together is that it's pretty clear in the statute what is required of this first climate action plan when it comes to mitigation. This, as I said, it may not be, but it could be the only plan before we hit the 2025 statutory requirement for greenhouse gas reduction. So we know at the very least that the policies and plan and rules that we put forward in the mitigation component of the plan have to add up to the 2025 emissions reduction. And then we also know that it's really only one more plan likely between now and 2030 that we will have to get to the 2030 requirements, which, as I'm sure many of you know, are much harder than the 2025 because of the baseline that the two are going off of. The 2025 statutory requirement builds off of the 26% reduction below 2005 levels, which was actually our biggest year for greenhouse gases. So going 25% below that isn't as hard as going 50% below 1990 levels, which is 2030 requirements. So we have a much heavier lift to get to the 2030 statutory requirement than we do for this first one. But regardless, this plan will need to set us on a course to meeting the statutory requirement for 2030. And so what I will say, though, is it's a little more open-ended when it speaks to what's required of this first climate action plan when it comes to sequestration goals and resiliency work. And so that's one of the things that we want to tease out in the conversation with the council on Monday. And I am hoping that through this conversation with all of you, we can sort of start to get at what a common understanding of it is for what the specificity is that we want to bring to this first climate action plan around our sequestration and resiliency work. And then even further for this, you know, I had a harder time sort of setting up the broad bucket categories for the sequestration work and the resiliency work in the plan. And so I'd love to use this time to also sort of tease that out with all of you and think about if I've gotten it right or how we could do it better. And recognizing that this has been sent to the Climate Council already for Monday, but that this would inform how I could share that, the outline with the Climate Council on Monday, having had the chance to have input from all of you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so if you haven't had a chance to look at it, you know, we could sort of go here and there about sort of the formalities up at the front, but these are sort of the general components of all the climate action plans that I've looked at, with the guiding principles being front and center. And I'll just use this chance to say that this is one of the tensions right now, the guiding principles development, and you know, all the subcommittees diving deep into their work plan, the actual implementation of their work plans, because really you should have the guiding principles in front of you to inform any of the work that you're doing within with your task leads. And so I'm sort of, we're gonna see this, I think, on Monday with the Climate Council when we talk about engagement, as well as the guiding principles in the work of just transitions, and sort of the tension around like giving them the space to get that right and get it to all of you, but you guys also needing to hit milestones to get us on, keep us on track, I should say, for the December 1st timeline. So last night at the Just Transitions Committee meeting, they went really deep into guiding principles, which was really great foundational work for getting those drafted. And this afternoon, we're meeting as a small group to sort of set up a track for drafting those based on last night's meeting. And so really great progress on that. And I'm excited for that. And hopefully in the next, hopefully as soon as the next 2 weeks, guiding principles will be available for subcommittees, and that will be front and center in our climate action plan. So right from there, the plan sort of breaks up the strategies for mitigation by the sectors, the way that the task leads have broken up into for the work around this. And the way that we're thinking about it for the climate action plan is to sort of batch this in like two main buckets: the strategies and recommendations that we know are ready for implementation right out of the gate and need to go and need to be part of meeting our mitigation requirements. And then thinking about what those strategies are, what the recommendations are for each strategy, knowing that there'll be a suite of strategies, and then within the suite of strategies, a suite of recommendations, which all will take a lot of detail and work to get us to the complete plan. And then teasing out what the strategies are requiring additional development. So knowing how close can we get to 2000, well, knowing that we have to add up to 2025 statutory requirements, and we have to get to close to getting to 2030, what's additionally required and what's it going to take to get it to be ready to go for the next climate action plan. And then the additional considerations is really very left to be a broad bucket category around what's the vision for 2050 and where additional research and development is needed. And again, this is broken up into the sectors, the way their task leads are working. So transportation, buildings, electricity, and then ag and non-energy emissions. And we just called out ag, recognizing that there's a lot of focus on agriculture, both by cross-sector and then the ag and ecosystems subcommittee. And also because it's the largest emissions sector within that non-energy emissions component. So here, this is the next thing, is just a chance for us to add up the work and the strategies and recommendations based on the modeling that we're doing at the end. And then we move into sequestration, and this is where it gets more applicable to you all, because their task leads are working on, and I'm not sure that we have these titles quite right yet, but the carbon budget is going to be a big component of that work, trying to get us to look at not only our gross emissions, but also how well we do at sequestering them. And I suspect there'll be a recommendation out of this work group around enhancing the language around sequestration in the law, because as you may or may not remember, there's no mention of net zero until 2050 in the law, but based on the statutory requirements for greenhouse gas reduction, we're going to get to net zero sometime between 2030 and 2035. And we know we could do better for sequestration, and we don't want to stop there. So how do we think about enhancing sequestration on the landscape? The same sort of buckets again about strategies for immediate implementation and additional development and additional considerations. And this is what is really sort of up in the air, because we know that the strategies for immediate implementation in the mitigation side have to add up to 2025, and that's what they're really working towards. Like, they're working towards those statutory requirements, but I'll ask of you guys, like, what are going to be your immediate implementation ideas, and what's going to be your accumulation of ideas and what you want to be getting to, what that goal is. So I'll just say they're also working on forest and natural land sequestration, and then ag land sequestration, and then sort of this cumulative assessment again. And two of their actual task leads and work groups, I should say, really are around nature-based solutions. And that seemed like it fit really, and that's where the overlap is with you all on resiliency and adaptation. So there's a work group in ag and ecosystems, but that's really a resiliency strategy. And so I moved that from sort of above in sequestration into your bucket, but that's coming out of ag and ecosystems. And then they're also working on the resiliency of both of economic and food systems, thinking about long-term resiliency for food growing and the systems that support food growing in Vermont. Again, it's a resiliency strategy, and that'll be under your topic. So then I tried, this is my best shot at sort of broad brushed strategies for buckets of work that you're all working on. And again, this is what I need help with. So I put community resilience, and the municipal in parentheses is not intended to describe what I mean by community. I'm thinking really broad here. But I just sort of thought that all the municipal work that you have broken up into task leads would fit under here, nested in a larger scope of what does community resilience in Vermont look like, and what does that mean to all of you. And then I had the climate emergency preparedness component of your work, and then community and public health. So the question here to me is, do those three broad buckets capture the work that this subcommittee is doing? Could they be better communicated? And if so, how? And then for you to start to give some thought to sort of the cumulative assessment of what your work is going to try to bring to bear for the climate action plan, and start to test that at some point with the Climate Council to see if the Climate Council supports sort of the level of specificity that you all want to get to. So that was a lot of just me talking. So I'll pause there and suggest that we just start to talk through some of this, and I'm open to hearing any critique, criticism, anything about this. It's just a first shot.
Jane, Chad here. Is there any way you could drop this into the chat so we could sort of, I'm curious to look up at a couple of things that you touched on.
Yes.
And,
yeah, I could do that, I think. That's testing my Zoom skills, but I think I can.
Chad, I also sent it out. This was included in an email I sent earlier today.
This was it? Okay, got it. I've got that email right here. That's fine, thanks.
I really want to do it though.
I have a couple thoughts, and I was thinking, you know, this would potentially screw up your whole organization. So, but I'll just throw it out there anyway. I mean, I was thinking, you know, for resilience, it's useful to think about, you know, resilient to what, right? And maybe organize the strategies that way. I mean, that would be a different way to do it. So, you know, so one of the issues, of course, is extreme weather, and you know, you could sort of look at the different sectors related to that, so whether it's transportation or housing, or built environment or the natural environment, you could kind of, identify your strategies to extreme weather for the built environment, the natural environment, and then, more, drill down more on both of those two major sectors would be kind of one way to think about it. So that's just a thought that I have, and because there's different strategies, for that, addressing that threat versus like vector-borne diseases, which maybe are really that's a public health kind of thing, and the strategies might be focused on that, and that might provide a framework for the way that we measure success too, because we may want to ask ourselves, it's like, how resilient are we to extreme weather events? And there's certain sectors that are just much more vulnerable, right, to that. And same thing with health, like how resilient are we to vector-borne diseases? And so it's really those might be more public health kind of measures. So that's, and I realize that's, I never like when people say, hey, how about if we do this completely different way after you've sort of thought it through, but that's a thought that I have, and I'll just leave that one there, and I have some other thoughts, but other folks may want to.
Well, I guess I wonder if I like the way you're framing it a lot, and I don't necessarily see it as having to be totally different. So I guess I wonder if it's really just a matter of how you're framing the strategies and recommendations underneath the titles, because like I like the way you're like framing it, like resilient to what makes a lot of sense to me, and it allows you to be broad in nature around thinking about all of the potential threats from climate change to the landscape, both built and natural, and then allows you to tee up how you want to frame your strategies and recommendations to deal with those threats.
Yeah, I think it could hang off of this. Yeah, I think it could hang off of the structure.
Yeah.
It'll need a situation statement. I mean, that's basically what we're talking about, where we describe the threats and hazards, specifically as they relate to climate change on Vermont specifically. And that may be where we need to lean on the science and data folks, because obviously our state climatologist is on there, and she also led the group that did the part of the assessment for the national climate assessment for the Northeast. So she'll have a lot of data specific, that we can draw upon that can outline, specifically what the threats and hazards are in Vermont and what their impacts are. And then that will lead into all of the rest of our recommendations.
Right. Yeah, she keeps speaking up about that too, because I know she wants to help with that. And I still see like potentially we didn't really get that quite right, or that body of work right in our RFP, and that it could be a grant to UVM for her to think about how to tease that up for this plan in particular, the Vermont specific component.
We have it to a certain extent, actually probably to a great extent, in the hazard mitigation plan. But it's, the hazard mitigation plan takes in, it's a hazard mitigation plan. It's not about specific to climate change, although it factors strongly in it. So it's, it may be something where we already have data and information to pull from for this plan.
So Chad here, I think it'll be really helpful, just switching gears a little bit, helpful to understand where Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee, their work with respect to carbon sequestration, and because there's going to be an inherent tension there, between actively, active ag land versus other types of, land use, ground cover, whatever. There's starting to be a decent amount of academic research out there that speaks to the benefit, and I'm speaking from the solar world because that's the world I swim in, where agricultural land finished with solar and with ground cover that is, finished with either native grasses or pollinator friendly habitat has a significant increase in carbon sequestration as compared to, business as usual, whether that be hay or soybeans or corn crops. So there's definitely just going to be this tension there that we're going to need to address. So I'd be curious to understand where those conversations are going, I guess, with respect to sequestration, and we're just seeing this week in the news that the Biden administration is, looking to actually monetize that carbon sequestration benefit as part of climate planning over the next decade. So I think there's a lot of bang for the buck there for Vermont, and we just need, and we are different than, states like Massachusetts or other states where agriculture is perhaps a less dominant land use. So it'll be interesting to sort of see how that plays out. And I'm happy to speak with them about some of the research that we're following on this front. A lot of it is computer modeling based because there just isn't a lot of empirical data yet. But it's coming, and the modeling, speaks to improved ecosystem functions, in the presence of, larger scale solar, which I know is going to be somewhat controversial.
Yeah, of course. Well, I actually think that has a lot of overlap, both with the food, like the resiliency around food systems, but then also Ryan Patch obviously is thinking a lot about ag emissions, and then there's the sequestration group for both ag and forest sequestration. Yep. And there's been a lot of thought at the agency recently. There was the legislative work group that finished a year ago around carbon credits, and then that required the Agency of Natural Resources to look at a pilot sale for a carbon market program. And so Ali Kasiba, who's staffing the Ag and Ecosystems Committee, chaired that work group, and ANR is moving forward with a carbon project on both an FPR land and a fish and wildlife land now. And I think that's, to the benefit of Vermonters for the agency to get into it and provide some technical experience around that. But then thinking about solar and how it all fits together, I think will really be interesting, and considering the food market as well as sequestration on those lands. So I think.
Sorry, Jane. That's where it gets really interesting, because there is going to be this increased nexus between, and there's going to be competition for this land, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a competitive situation. There's going to be a nexus between distributed energy and food production. Some of this research is starting to look at increased crop yields in the presence of solar. There's studies that show increased tomato yield, peppers, other, in the future, hopefully there's less tension between the either or argument, and it could be both. And it's going to need to be, quite frankly, to reach our goal.
Well, I wonder if there's a role just for you to speak with Abby a bit about that. She's chairing the food system one, and but has a really great suite. Lauren Oates is on it too, that group. So that would be a nice liaison component with her work in cross sector.
Yeah, I'd be happy to at least share some of the research that we're following as it speaks.
That's great.
And there's a growing body of research and scientific study around this. So all peer reviewed. So it's not industry sponsored. It's all academic.
Any other broad thoughts on the or on the topics at hand on how they've been described here around the resiliency work? And then, of course, starting to think about like the level. I wonder if it's really then at the work planning level for each of the task leads, thinking about how far you want to take each of these components and where your work as task leads fits into. Like if these are the right buckets, and then thinking about the work planning around where you want to get to with all of them.
So, yeah, I have another comment, and it's on the community or municipal resilience category in general. And I mean, I think community is such a broad term.
Yeah.
You know, it can mean lots of things, and municipal means something very specific. And I'm just, you know, as I read these bullets, at least the first two, I'm really thinking about infrastructure resilience, just like, you know, you have economic resilience as a, you know, topic, or food, you know, food systems as a topic. I think that infrastructure deserves kind of, you know, recognition at that same sort of level because it's just so important to everything that happens in our society. And so is that really what we're saying? You know, and obviously municipalities benefit from that, and, you know, broader communities. So it's really the third bullet that kind of throws that off a little bit. It's like, which one of these doesn't belong? And I still struggle with that third bullet about reducing fossil fuel consumption as a resilience kind of strategy. But I know it's in the act, and it's sort of it seems a little cumbersome to me and out of place there. But my main point is that I think infrastructure needs to be recognized at the same kind of level as the economy or food systems.
Yeah, I want to let Ben speak because I'm sure he has something astute to follow up on that. But I will just say that that sort of speaks to your original comment about speaking to how the what of what we're trying to make resilient. And I wonder, you know, if we're also speaking up here to nature-based solutions and making that, I mean, that is clearly about how do we make working lands, natural systems more resilient in the future, both for the sake of themselves as well as to be more resilient for all these other components down below. So I like that, and maybe we don't need something as broad as community resilience, especially if we talk about, I don't know, we should think about how we think about this. I mean, clearly we're going to reduce municipal, school district, and residential fossil fuel consumption based on the strategies up above coming out of cross sector, but really your component is how to tee up like these to make them ready and resilient to actually implement those choices, which I can't quite see yet where that fits.
Well, no,
Ben,
I'm
go
saying,
ahead.
I guess,
Oh, sorry.
I'm really just saying it's about infrastructure resilience. I'd like to,
Yeah,
you know,
okay, yeah.
That's my, you know, I guess that's who I'm representing here anyway, is the transportation agency and infrastructure.
So it's
Go ahead.
Let me take my hand down while I remember. Well, I'll do that later. I am also thinking about how we define community or municipal resilience. So on the same thread, I've had an interesting conversation with Chris Campany. And maybe it's because I haven't studied the outline thoroughly enough yet to know the answer. But the question that is in my mind is where land use and governance, decision-making fits into our outline. And I think that in order to have true community resilience, it's not enough to have infrastructure resilience. I think you need community resilience of your decision-making process. And I actually think that what we're in danger of in this outline is doing what we do in state government and what we do in our planning, which is that everything is in silos by program. And it's how do they connect going forward? Because the day is going to come in 2025 and 2030 and on into the future when agricultural objectives and transportation objectives and economic development objectives are going to conflict and compete. And so good planning to implement the broad vision is going to have to be holistic. And I think the best tool we have to do that in Vermont, in the absence of county government, is regional planning commissions. And I think we need to think about the role that our regional planning commissions and the support we provide to them to assist communities in managing this many different things at a time is integral to the plan going forward. And I'm not sure where it fits in. That's my 2 cents.
Well, I'm not quite sure exactly how to respond, except that I hear you and totally support that. And also will say that in the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee meeting this morning, there was a lot of talk around, perhaps, the silos, which we've tried to create for efficiency of sort of moving through the process. Rather than looking to stay in our swim lanes within the subcommittees, that we should really be leaning into cross-cutting ideas, because that's where we're going to get the most support and rise up strategies and recommendations that have the most impact across a lot of different arenas. And so there was this feeling of especially when we're overlapped with rural resilience and adaptation, that we should be really elevating those ideas. And I as far as land use and governance, I certainly see a role for it in nature-based solutions. And I wonder if nature-based solutions is not termed right in some way, because I certainly think land use planning and the role of governments and how we set things up, it has a role in that, as it does in probably other components here too. But just thinking about that.
Well, to build off of what Ben just said, and connect it with my previous comment on infrastructure, I mean, maybe there is a community resilience element here that needs to be considered. That's kind of stands alone on stands on its own and has strategy specific to it. And maybe that's where the the connections are made under that particular category. And that's maybe where people fit in too.
I think they're going to, we're going to have to define it in the plan. I mean, because we will be talking about, what we're talking about is calling out certain sectors that could benefit from more resilience to climate change. And I agree with that, because otherwise, if you make recommendations that are broad brush under these categories that are too broad, then folks are going to be left wondering, okay, what does that actually mean? Versus when you talk about infrastructure specifically, or when you talk about individuals and community networks and the health of those at the municipal or local level, that then people are able to make associations when they're reading through the recommendations and understand what they're meant to build resilience into. I have one comment about climate emergency preparedness and community public health, because I'm just wondering, what is the intent for those two categories, and how does that, are those placeholders, or are they meant to have recommendations under them that are specific to emergency preparedness and community public health?
So this was my attempt at a broad category based on all the work that you're incorporating from the hazard mitigation plan and other buckets, and giving it a title here to sort of refine that to the climate aspects of that work. And then the community health, the stuff Joe spoke to with insect-borne diseases, resilience around other components of that, Leslie Ann's expertise, that's the intent of here. And yes, it would have these same two things, strategies, and then that would be for immediate implementation, strategies requiring additional development, and then additional considerations. Those components would get repeated under each of these buckets, recognizing that some would have a lot and some would have only a few.
Yeah, there was just a couple comments on both of those. We definitely will need to have some actions in our work plan that speak specifically to those categories for the climate action plan, because we don't really have that called out specifically, which is not, not a something that should hold us back. But I'll just point out that as it relates to climate emergency preparedness, when we talk about emergency preparedness, we talk about it in the context of all hazards. And so climate is not a specific hazard. Climate change is not a specific hazard. it's, fluvial erosion is a specific hazard, inundation flooding, ice storms or snow. Those are specific hazards. So I would really need to put some thought into the value and how what would need to go in here as it relates to climate emergency preparedness that doesn't kind of go against the grain of everything. We could put the state emergency management plan in here. That's climate emergency preparedness. So go ahead, Ben.
I'm glad Erica said that. That's kind of what I was thinking too, is that climate change is overarching. It's at a higher level than the hazards that we plan for, which are things like ice storms and insect invasions and pandemics, and floods, of course. So I actually think that climate emergency preparedness and community public health are things that are addressed through our emergency plans. And I think they can roll into this category where you're calling community resilience. I want to come back to my point again, that I think that how communities plan and how we resource our small communities and regions to plan is part of what makes us resilient. So what we really need to do is empower communities to do good multi-hazard planning and to address changes and challenges going forward. That's part of community resilience. And the other co-benefit is that it cleans up your outline. It's already a very big, complicated thing. So I'm suggesting that you simplify by bulletizing those into this thing we're starting to define as community resilience.
What do others think about that? It would be more like community resilience is broad, but then there are strategies underneath it that speak to emergency preparedness, public health, and then broader issues, other issues. Like it. I don't know if I'm keeping some notes too that are separate from the screen.
So where did infrastructure fit into that? I guess I lost.
Oh yeah, we could still give you your own infrastructure resilience.
Oh, good.
No, I think I agree, Joe. I think it needs to be called out specifically.
Yeah,
it would be a glaring omission if it wasn't in there.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to call out infrastructure and then put the others underneath. I like it.
Marion has her hand raised.
Thanks. Just one thought. I'm looking at the Global Warming Solutions Act, the section on rural resilience and adaptation subcommittee, and the sort of opening paragraph. It talks about the subcommittee focusing on the pressures that climate change adaptation will impose on a number of sectors. And it looks like we have transportation listed, electricity, emergency services, and communications infrastructure, but there's nothing in this outline currently about housing. And so I'm just wondering, both in the context of housing and sort of thinking about the way that the sentence is structured in the act, where it talks about the pressures that adaptation will pose on rural communities. So I'm sort of thinking along the lines of, how is this subcommittee, or how are we looking to do outreach or thought for these rural communities that are going to be economically stressed? Their housing is going to be stressed because of the adaptation measures that are being put in place. And a lot of that leads me to think of housing. So I'm just wondering, for the council or subcommittee members, where you all see housing and sort of the stress that adaptation measures that the state will look to impose on rural communities, how that factors into this outline.
That is excellent, Marion. I'd love to hear a comment. Thank you for bringing us back to that.
I think that also, I think that underscores the importance of defining community resilience in the plan, and defining what we are and what we aren't talking about. So if we're lumping housing and recommendations as it relates to housing and being prepared, or helping communities be more prepared in terms of the impact and stresses on their housing as they are adapting to climate change hazards. that should fold under there, but that's why we got to really specifically define it.
So you're saying that housing would fit under community, Erica? I am not, for myself, I am not squarely on one side of the fence or the other. I don't have any specific ideas of what community should and shouldn't. I mean, I feel strongly infrastructure deserves its own category. When we talk about community, we could either have a broad brush definition of what community means, or we could take out community and we could sub-bullet the sectors of the community that we're talking about. So we're being really specific. So we're talking about housing, or we're talking about community networks, and we're talking about all of the other things that would roll under community. I don't have a strong feeling either way, as long as it's clear what we're talking about.
Where do you think housing is fitting right now within your work planning? Is it someone on first with that? Or do we identify a gap?
Well, it is one where we probably need to be more specific, and because I don't have the work plan up in front of me, but it definitely falls under the area where we're having to make recommendations on, but it doesn't, because the act doesn't talk about, when you look at the objectives, it doesn't talk about housing specifically. It's not called out specifically. That was the challenge we had with some of the overlapping language in the bill.
Okay, I'll just make a note that to come back.
So Jane, I know you have to go at 2. We're 4 minutes over.
Okay. This has been really actually helpful for me, and I'd like to sort of put my notes into some bullet points that I'll just share around. We won't have time to have feedback on it before Monday's meeting, but I'll try to use them as a prompt, perhaps, and Erica and Secretary Curley, others who will be on the council meeting on Monday can speak. Feel free to speak up and cover what we're talking about here for further refinement of the outline.
Okay.
That it's not perfect yet.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you.
I know Jane has to go, but are there any other kind of overarching comments from folks about the framework and how that translates into our work? Hi, Judith.
Hi. Is this the time when I'm not a member of the committee, but can I speak as a member of the public?
Sure. Actually, we're going into that section of our meeting now. So
I wait my turn. Fine.
So why don't you go ahead, Judith?
I wondered, as we're thinking about rural resilience, I wondered to what extent you're going to be including some of the social aspects of rural resilience. As we think about resilience in our little town, which is Irishburg, which is undisputably rural, as we thought about resilience as a planning commission, we recognized that the relationships of trust and cooperation and mutual help and the ways that we've learned to work together as a community might be our greatest resource when it came to dealing with outside threats. There are a lot of things we can't deal with in a little town. We don't have a lot of control over climate change. international markets and the price of milk, and all sorts of things that don't have much, that we don't have much say over. But what we can influence is the way we treat each other, the way we work together, the way we are able to cooperate. And I feel as if in building resilient communities, that's a factor that we really need to take into account and encourage. So I wondered whether that's on your guys' radar at all.
Yeah, Judith, that's a really good point. And that's when I talk about community networks, that's really what I'm talking about is the community level support that exists, whether it is through faith-based organizations or community organizations. We find, especially in disaster recovery, those communities that are able to pull together and band together and organize at a grassroots level are able to help folks that have been impacted by disasters recover much more quickly. But how do we quantify that as it relates to resilience to climate change is really the nut that needs to be cracked. So it's a great point.
How do we find ways to encourage it when it comes to climate change? That's a question I think we ought to be thinking about.
Ben, I saw you came on camera. Do you have something to add to that?
Well, I think this is a really excellent point, and it's always something that comes up when we talk about defining resilience. It's a hard thing to define, and when FEMA comes to Vermont, they say, wow, your communities are so resilient. And in some places we show up and people say, what should we do? And in Vermont, we show up and people say, here's what we're doing and here's what we need help with. And so FEMA sees us as having this organic community cohesion that allows us to respond organically to whatever the thing is, a flood or a pandemic or whatever comes next. And there's been some really good discussion in the community providers webinars put on by the Vermont Council on Rural Development over the past year. Some excellent discussions with Front Porch Forum and with local libraries, with a lot of the things that provide glue in communities. And I still come back to giving the local volunteers the resources and support to do good holistic planning. I mean, I imagine that if you're on the Planning Commission in Irisburg, you're one of the few brave local leaders who's willing to ride the tiger of all the stuff that's being asked of communities. And we have communities where it's just a few brave people who are taking on all these different burdens, and we're not even, and then we ask the regional planning commissions to provide them support by cobbling together their budgets from the different funding scraps they can get from the various state agencies that want specific deliverables from them. And so there's a very high transaction cost for the regional planning commissions to even survive, much less to give the local volunteers exactly what they need. So I see it as all part of the same question. But you're absolutely right that we have to get to that crux of what keeps us in a functional civil environment.
We couldn't do it without the regional planning commissions. They are absolutely essential to the town planning efforts. They are invaluable. I don't know how they do it with the resources they have, but we really couldn't make it without them.
Thank you, Judith. Ian Hitchcock has his hand up.
Thank you, Erica. And I'm kind of joining the public comment part of the train. I'm Ian Hitchcock from Vermont Natural Resources Council. I'm the Energy and Climate Program Associate there. And hearing this conversation, I had a few thoughts to add. First of all, I really appreciate the eloquence with Judith articulated the kind of need of rural and social resilience, and Ben, the emphasis you've brought on trying to resource that and not just count on that to happen in its own sake. From my vantage point, I have worked a lot with the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network, or VCAN, which is made up of volunteer town energy committees all across the state in both very rural and, I mean, I guess there's not particularly very urban places in Vermont, but at least very rural and very less rural places all across the state. And I would want to emphasize and highlight them as one potential avenue of a group of people who are both desperate for ways to be helpful and to be of use, and where there is already some existing social infrastructure of people who care about these particular issues, who've been thinking about them for a while, who've decided to devote some of their volunteer time to these concerns, and are really, looking for and frankly struggling with ways to plug in. And I think the work of the Climate Council offers an opportunity to try to think about, when we're thinking about, the need for social resilience and social connections, and as just as important layers of infrastructure as transmission lines and power, that they are a group that should not be forgotten. And jumping on the Regional Planning Commission side of things, so I have often worked with regional planning commissions to try to support regional gatherings of energy committees to try to help. And I think when I think about the challenges of rural resilience, and I say this both as someone who has lived in very rural places and as someone who's worked with people in them, isolation is like challenge number one, whether that's isolation socially or isolation from resources, or knowing about how to access resources, or having help and guidance on how to get there. Whereas folks who, maybe from more places where the resources are being discussed and generated just have fewer barriers to understanding, how to access programs or, get assistance with the sorts of adaptation measures that are being discussed. And so looping back to the RPC part of the conversation, I have had, very mixed success, I think, in partnering with RPCs, due in no small part, and that's not a knock on any of the RPCs, it's just they simply do not have the capacity to do everything that is asked of them. They are largely planning organizations, it's right there in the name. And one of the things I've observed in Vermont is that Vermont really does great with planning and struggles with implementation. We've got a lot of great plans that sit on the shelf. And I think the very, a key reason that the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed and that the Climate Council exists is to try to get from this planning space to an implementation space. I think, because we've had greenhouse gas reduction goals forever that we blow right by. And I think that is kind of an underlying impetus that, while it may not be in the text of the Global Warming Solutions Act itself, it is very much the subtext of why it felt necessary to pass something like the Global Warming Solutions Act. And one key area that I think would be tremendously helpful would be, suggesting giving more resources to and support to regional planning commissions to serve as kind of intermediaries and mediaries between rural communities in particular, and programs of both federal and state government that are going out. I know in terms of federal ARPA dollars, for instance, people have a lot of questions about, well, there's money coming to my municipalities. How do I shape where that goes? Try to identify needs, and RPCs can play a critical kind of convening and coordinating within their regions, trying to help, again, these rural places be connected to each other, as well as helping all places in Vermont understand what resources are available to them, and how they could implement them at the local level. So just wanting to build on this sense of the social infrastructure is just as important as the other infrastructure. And then one other quick point, and I know we're over time, is that one thing that I haven't heard come up as much in these conversations that I think would be valuable to consider is the basically making how helping people get off of fossil fuels is a way of helping them become more resilient and making them less dependent on variable fuel prices where we don't know what they will do based on demand in terms of, fossil fuels that we don't want to burn. So putting in place, programs that are accessible and available to rural folks, helping them get over the upfront cost, because it's true that you do save money when you go to something like an electric vehicle over the long term, or switching from home heating oil to a heat pump, but it's that upfront cost that can often be such a barrier for people that don't have the resources to handle it upfront. So thinking about, in terms of a rural resilience context and rural adaptation context, not only from a kind of disaster management perspective, but from a how do we help people adapt away from a fossil fuel-based economy to meet their needs, particularly around heating and transportation, to ideally renewably generated electric sources. how do you get them the resources they need to actually access the savings, become more personally and financially resilient when they can't put up front capital in it themselves?
All really good points. Thanks so much, Ian. Any other public comment this afternoon? Okay, folks. So we're going to move to wrap up our meeting this afternoon. All really good discussion, and I was really happy to be able to talk through the climate action plan framework. I began my career as a planner, so there's really nothing that excites me more than a really good plan. Just for members that are on, I'll be talking with Catherine and Pat Field from CBI early next week about the agenda next Friday. We are going to be framing a meeting where we take a deeper dive into equity and justice issues around resilience, and I think specifically around disaster resilience, and framing that up. I think that'll help us as we're looking at our recommendations to be incorporated into the climate action plan. We want to have that conversation right up front. But if you have any thoughts about the way that conversation is framed, as well as any when you look at the work plan and you look at what you are responsible for, what we need for agenda items or discussions for future meetings that will help in you completing your work. And then finally, I did send out the work plan this morning. We will take final comments on that because we revised the format of that. Please send those comments to Catherine Dimitrick so that by next Friday, so that we can finalize that. Okay, any parting comments or thoughts? All right, have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.